You've certainly had the chance to see combat in Iraq and operate in Iraq. It's something that none of us probably have ever experienced. How does what you are seeing now in the conditions that you are operating in compare to other war zones that you've lived through?
You know, I've seen combat and war wounds and have done surgery with humanitarian and disaster relief now for almost 20 years. And this is nothing like this.
That was an American trauma surgeon who is currently trapped in Gaza following Israel's capture of the Rafah border crossing. Now, Dr. Adam Hamawi is the individual that you just heard from, and he's talking about the nightmarish experiences he has had as a doctor in Gaza. And he's far from the only American doctor trapped in Gaza as we speak. We're gonna give you more details on the others in just a moment. But I do think it's worth hearing a little more about what his experiences have been in the Gaza Strip during this ongoing war that has been waged against allegedly Hamas, but clearly when you look at the death toll, many Palestinians have perished as a result of Israel's war on Gaza. Let's take a look at what else he has to say.
I take care of more, people under the age of 13 than I've ever taken care of before. I've done more amputations and seen more traumatic amputations of children than I've seen during my entire career in the last 2 weeks. And that's what's really making a difference. In Iraq, there was some civilian casualties. Here, it's like primarily just children, women, elderly. Today I took care of 4 children, 1 woman, and like 2 people over the age of like 60. And this is not like typical of, the wars that I've like experienced in the past. So this is like, really the main, this is not like a war. This is just like a complete utter destruction. There's nothing like left. Like I was able to actually venture out of the hospital and there's like nothing left in the area around us. It's like just flattened, completely flattened.
I mean, everything that he said there is easily verifiable. Aerial footage of the Gaza Strip shows major portions of it being completely leveled. You have the death toll, which is mostly women and children. And even the United States, Anthony Blinken confirmed that the United States and its newly released report indicates that far more civilians in Gaza have died as opposed to Hamas militants. Now, if you think that is the only American doctor who's currently trapped in Gaza, you would be mistaken, because according to reporting by The Intercept, there are as many as 20 American doctors and medical workers currently trapped in Gaza following Israel taking hold and control of the Rafah border crossing. And of course, the Rafah border crossing is on the southern end of the Gaza Strip. And The Intercept's Ryan Grimm, doing incredible reporting, holding our government's feet to the fire, decided to question US State Department Deputy Spokesperson Vedant Patel about the American doctors that are currently trapped in Gaza. Take a look.
Citizens, doctors who are at the European hospital in Khan Younis facing dehydration. At least one of them is on an IV drip now. Our understanding is that relatives have been in touch with the State Department, US administration. Is there anything you can say about efforts to get them out?
We're aware of these reports of US citizens, doctors, and medical professionals currently unable to leave Gaza. As I said before, we don't control this border crossing, and this is a incredibly complex situation that has very serious implications for the safety and security of US citizens. But we're continuing to work around the clock with the government of Israel, with the government of Egypt, to work on this issue, not just to address the very serious humanitarian assistance concerns that I just talked about.
What does it say about conditions more generally in Rafah and in Khan Younis if American doctors who only arrived there recently are already suffering from dehydration and malnutrition?
So look, we have not been unambiguous about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. It is a crisis.
Let me get this straight. There's upward of 20 American doctors currently trapped in Gaza as we speak. And America's greatest ally, Israel, is making it difficult for us to allow the American doctors to leave the Gaza Strip. Am I getting that correct? Is that correct? That is the story. It is a complicated, complex situation, according to the US State Department, to allow American doctors to leave the Gaza Strip. Why is that complex? If Israel is our greatest ally, a shining democracy in a region full of terrible, scary Muslims and Arabs. This is insane. This is literally the craziest update to what Americans are dealing with in the Gaza Strip. All right, well, friend of the show, Ken Klippenstein, also is helping Americans, kind of get a little more clarity on the Biden administration's alleged halt on weapon shipments to Israel. Now, remember, just to give you a refresher on this portion of the story, the Biden administration says, you know what, Rafah is our red line. We do not want Israel to do a ground invasion into Rafah. And in fact, we are going to withhold weapons to Israel if it becomes clear to us that they do intend on engaging in a ground invasion. Now, to be sure, Israel's already bombing Rafah. So I love how this is reported and framed in the press as if ooh, Israel's thinking about it, but are they gonna do it? They're already bombing Rafah. Okay, just last week, they asked 100,000 already displaced Palestinians who had been sheltering in Rafah to evacuate so they can bomb the region. Okay, so that's already happening. But even here on this show, we've been very critical of the Biden administration, but we were willing to give them a little bit of credit for halting weapon shipments to Israel. And finally, for once, having a red line. Well, it's way more complicated than that.
Pausing here to deliver some honest truth as we do in our news coverage as well. TYT is facing challenges, guys, as the entire industry is. You know who could make the difference? You. If you hit the join button below, it's gonna make all the difference and keep us in business. We appreciate you, thank you.
So let's go to Ken Klippenstein's reporting over at Substack. By the way, please subscribe to Ken's work. He's doing wonderful reporting as always. So he writes that the most intense phase of the conflict involving air power, that means fighter jets that drop the bombs Biden is threatening to suspend, has already occurred. Israel's second phase was a shift to more targeted attacks using drones, artillery, and infantry to root out Hamas fighters and attack the underground tunnel network. I feel like that's what they should have done in the very beginning and throughout this war. The targeted attacks going after Hamas, but okay. Klippenstein also states what should be obvious to people who consider the fact that the bombings have already been taking place in Rafah. So he writes that a move into Rafah City, Israel has already invaded Gaza and even Rafah State, wouldn't involve the type of weapons Biden has said he would suspend. And as the Israelis have alluded to, complaining about larger weapons being used, 2,000-pound bombs, while denying smaller ones makes no sense in terms of preserving Palestinian lives. More civilians are dying right now because of the humanitarian disaster created by the war, meaning the famine, the lack of humanitarian aid entering the Gaza Strip. More Palestinians currently are starting to die as a result of that, as opposed to the aerial bombardments that were taking more Palestinian lives earlier in this war. So there's the lack of humanitarian aid, people dying of hunger, dehydration. And then there's also, in that paragraph, that excerpt I just read to you, the issue of the US halting the shipment of smaller bombs, but continuing the shipment of the 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs. How does that make any sense? As Klippenstein writes, it doesn't make any sense at all. But according to US officials, an assault on Rafah appears to be on the horizon, as if the assault on Rafah hasn't already been happening. The Israeli Defense Forces have amassed and prepared enough personnel on the edge of Rafah to suggest they could be ready to go into other areas of the densely populated city, two anonymous US officials said. But it is unclear whether Israel has made a final decision about when and how to proceed. Well, the IDF has been engaging in more military activity in the northern and central portion of the Gaza Strip. The areas where they said they had already effectively and successfully rooted out Hamas. Turns out they didn't. Because what the current Israel military is doing with their current military actions is they're breeding more extremism, if you ask me. at least as a human being who knows how I would react to my entire family being wiped out, I can easily say that Israel's actions currently breed more extremism. The more innocent people who get killed, the more anger, rage, desire for retaliation arises. I mean, this is, again, human nature. Now, speaking of Biden, by the way, he shouldn't be surprised that Israel is going into Rafah despite his threats. After all, he's the one who said this just back in March.
What is your red line with Prime Minister Netanyahu? Do you have a red line? For instance, would invasion of Rafah, which you have urged him not to do, would that be a red line?
It is a red line, but I'm never going to leave Israel.
Okay, well then why would Israel change any of its behavior? I mean, if you broadcast to the world that you're going to defend Israel no matter what, why would they change their behavior? Why would they take Biden's threats about invading Rafah seriously? I wouldn't. And by the way, while Biden pretends to have a red line when he really doesn't, I do want to make clear that there are plenty of people in the United States, including in our military, who have a red line. And one of those individuals is a gentleman by the name of Harrison Mann. He's a US Army major who has actually resigned from his post to take a stand against the United States and its unwavering commitment to Israel, regardless of how it carries out this war. And we ought to make that distinction real quick, right? Because there is a difference between not believing Israel should have the right to defend itself. Harrison Mann doesn't fall in that category. Like most people who have been critical of the war in Gaza, he has an issue with how this war has been prosecuted, how Israel has carried out their military operations in Gaza, which has killed far more Palestinian civilians as opposed to Hamas militants. So in November, the US Army Major Harrison Mann requested to resign over the government's support of Israel, and he wrote a resignation letter that I want to read some excerpts from. Bear with me, I know this is a lot of reading, but I think what he had to say was important. The policy that has never been far from my mind for the past 6 months is the nearly unqualified support for the government of Israel, which has enabled and empowered the killing and starvation of tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians. This unconditional support also encourages reckless escalation that risks wider war. We are actually incredibly lucky, by the way, that we're not engaged in war with Iran. We got real close. And luckily, Iran did not retaliate against Israel in a way that would lead to civilian casualties, to people dying. They damaged one building when they responded to Israel's attacks against Iran. And so luckily they didn't want to escalate the war, but I don't know how much longer Iran is gonna hold out. Hopefully Netanyahu doesn't attack Iran again, but who knows? I mean, when I look at the current government of Israel, there's just a lot of belligerent behavior without really considering how that behavior and how their actions against other sovereign countries would escalate this into a much broader regional war, and it would drag the United States into that broader regional war. And if a war with Iran is sparked by all of this, you don't think the US wouldn't have boots on the ground in Iran? Of course they would. That is a formidable military. This isn't some easy war that the United States and Israel would snap their fingers and end in a day. It would be a drawn out, bloody, devastating war. But let me get back to Harrison Mann. He says, I hoped time and time again that the latest outrage would finally prompt a material shift in support for Israel. I told myself my individual contribution was minimal, and that if I didn't do my job, someone else would. So why cause a stir for nothing? I know that I did, in my small way, wittingly advance that policy. And I want to clarify that as a descendant of European Jews, I was raised in a particularly unforgiving moral environment when it came to the topic of bearing responsibility for ethnic cleansing. Harrison Mann is an incredibly brave person, someone who actually has values, and he's willing to put everything on the line in order to protect those values, to live out those values. And I just give him a tremendous amount of credit because, again, I mean, he is causing a stir. And I can't imagine the kind of backlash he's dealing with. But to him, his integrity, his morals, his values are more important than staying quiet and continuing to do what was comfortable, the comfortable option. Don't stir the pot, don't critique what Israel's doing, don't criticize the US support for Israel, regardless of what Israel does. He decided to take a stand, and he deserves a lot of credit for that. And man is not the only one who sees the horror in Gaza for what it really is. Lately, IDF defenders have been singing the army's virtues thanks to a recently revised report by the UN regarding the death toll in Gaza. I talked about this briefly on the show yesterday, but I wanted to dedicate a little more time to talk about it because unfortunately, this misinterpretation, intentional misinterpretation, is spreading a lot of disinformation out there in regard to the death toll and what the UN was trying to communicate. So the UN humanitarian agency, OCHA, published a report on May 8th with revised data regarding the number of Palestinian casualties in the war. The UN agency, in its report, reduced the number of women and children believed to have been killed in the war by nearly half. So you read that as someone who's a fierce defender of Israel, and you're like, yes, yes. That death toll, that death toll number, that 35,000 person death toll number, that looked real bad. But look at the UN halved it. They halved it, yes. Anyone who, by the way, had that feeling, that celebratory air after reading this UN report, is admitting that the actual death toll number of 35,000 people is really high and looks really bad. Okay, so let's just keep that in mind. But let's also get into the details about what the UN was actually communicating, because they didn't literally have the number of the death toll as is reported by the Palestinian Health Ministry. The number was reduced because the UN says it is now relying on the number of deceased women and children whose names and other identifying details have been fully documented, rather than the total number of women and children killed. Remember, there are still bodies, by the way, trapped under the rubble that aren't even accounted for when it comes to the Palestinian Health Ministry's death toll numbers. And so what the UN is trying to do is verify the identities of the Palestinians who have been killed. And so far, they have been able to identify the identities of about half the people who have been killed in Gaza. So as a result, the number of women and children listed on the site appeared lower, lower than previously reported, because OCHA was listing only the breakdown of those who have been identified, while still noting the larger overall death toll above it. The total number of dead also does not include the approximately 10,000 people who are still missing and trapped under the rubble, according to officials from the Palestinian Ministry of Health. Now, Farhan Haq, who works at the UN as the deputy spokesperson for the Secretary General, actually addressed the disinformation that's been floating around in regard to the UN's report. And so let's hear him clarify things. I want you to hear it from his mouth, from the UN itself. Let's see what he has to say.
The overall number of fatalities that's been tallied by the Ministry of Health in Gaza, which is our counterpart on dealing with the death tolls, that number remains unchanged, and it's at more than 35,000 people since October 7th. What's changed is the Ministry of Health in Gaza has updated the breakdown of fatalities for whom full details have been documented. There's about another 10,000 plus bodies who still have to be fully identified. And so then the details of those, which of those are children, which of those are women, that will be reestablished once the full identification process is complete.
So please don't let anyone gaslight you about what the reality is on the ground in Gaza. There's a plethora of videos that you can watch for yourselves. Aerial footage that shows how the Gaza Strip has been pretty much destroyed. Residential buildings completely demolished, hospitals destroyed. The list goes on and on and on and on. There's complete famine in the northern half of the Gaza Strip. It's just absolute devastation. And rather than acknowledge the devastation and maybe reconsider the way the Israeli military is carrying out their military operations, I just feel like defenders of Israel want to pretend like what's actually happening on the ground isn't really happening, because they don't want to have to be confronted with the truth. How can you defend the current Israeli government when you see what's actually happening on the ground in Gaza? And if you do see what's happening on the ground in Gaza and you're fine with it, if you're fine with all those women and children, 2/3 of those who have been killed, women and children, if you're okay with that and you think that it is a just war because, Israeli lives are more important than Palestinian lives, okay, well then admit that. You might not be a great person in my eyes, but at least admit that. Take the mask off, stop pretending like you actually, see both sides, the civilians on both sides as equal in terms of human lives that deserve to be protected, and just admit that one side consists of civilian lives that you don't care about. Honestly, that is the messaging that Democratic voters in America have been getting from the Democratic Party. So just to go back to James Carville's video where he's like pulling he doesn't really have any hair on his head, but he's losing his mind over the fact that no one listens to Democrats anymore, that all the fear mongering about Trump isn't working anymore. How about you guys try listening to your constituents and what they have to say? More than 2/3 of Democratic voters are not happy with the ongoing war in Gaza. Doesn't mean that they don't believe Israel has no right to defend itself. It means that they do not agree with 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs being dropped on a densely populated region of the world where people have nowhere to escape and nowhere to go for safety. How about the Democrats listen to those people? Those are their voters. The difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, to be quite honest with you, is it really does feel like Republican politicians are terrified of their constituents and actually listen to them. That's not the sense I get with Democrats.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.